They gave my son a pair of boots that were too big for him, and told me he would only have to wear them for 900 yards. I remember the exact number because the sergeant said it the way a man says a thing he has measured with his own feet. 900 yards, ma'am, from the lantern arch to the memorial court, and your boy walks beside the line the whole way, behind his father's company, and no one will ask anything more of him than to keep his chin up. I had nodded. I had not believed a single word of it. I had spent 4 months learning that the things people promised me about that morning were rounded and soft, the way you round the edges off a stone before you give it to someone to hold, and I had stopped expecting any of it to be true. His name was Tomas, my son. 8 years old that spring, with his father's straight back and his father's habit of going very still when he was frightened, so that you could never tell. His father had stood the same way. I had married a man who could stand in a doorway with the worst news of his life behind his teeth, and you would think he had come home to ask what was for supper. I used to hate that stillness. I came to understand it only later, in the worst possible way, which is the only way most of us ever understand anything about the men who guard us. This is the story of the morning of the remembrance, and of the one guardsman in the whole long, gleaming line who broke the thing he was sworn to keep, and did it so quietly that I did not understand, until it was over, that he had given my son back his father for the length of 40 steps. I am writing it down because Tomas is grown now, and the men who were there are scattering, and because I have heard the morning told wrong 3 different ways, and a thing like that should be told by the woman who was holding the boy's hand. So I will start where it started, at the cold end of the lantern arch, in boots that were too big, with my son's fingers white around mine. The house of Verimund holds its remembrance on the first still morning after the autumn gales. They wait for stillness on purpose, because the standards must hang straight, and a flag that snaps in the wind looks like an argument, and they want it to look like a vow. That year the gales broke early, and the morning came up gray and breathless, and so quiet you could hear the river under the stone. We were brought in through a side gate before the public, the families of the fallen of the past year, 26 of us in dark coats, and we were arranged along the inside of the arch like furniture that had been told where to stand. I had been to the palace exactly once before, for the thing they do when they hand you the folded standard, and a man you have never met says words about your husband that he learned off a card. I had hated that too. I am telling you I went into that morning with both hands closed. "Will Papa's friends be there?" Tomas asked me. Not a question, really. He asked it looking straight ahead at the wall in the still way, and I knew he was frightened. "Yes," I said, "his whole company." "And will they know me?" I did not have an answer he would have wanted, so I squeezed his hand, and that was when the guardsman first looked at us. I want to be careful here, because the way I tell it is the way it felt, and the way it felt was not the way it works. There was a guardsman posted at the inner mouth of the arch, where the families waited, one of the ceremonial sentries in the tall black bearskin and the dark winter tunic they wear for the remembrance, gloved, motionless, his rifle grounded, his eyes set on the far stone as though there were a horizon in it. I had been told they do not look at you. That is half the point of them. They are a wall you can lean your grief against, and the wall does not flinch, and that steadiness is supposed to be a kindness, though it did not feel like one to me that morning. It felt like being furniture beside a statue. But he looked at Tomas, only for a moment and only with his eyes, his head never moving down at the boy, at the boots, and then back to his horizon. I would not have caught it if I had not been watching his face the way you watch a closed door. I learned his name later, Corporal Adair Linnet, of the company my husband had served, though I did not know that yet, and he gave no sign of it, and I have thought a great deal since about what it cost him to give no sign of it. A steward came down the line with a clipboard and a soft, rehearsed voice. He stopped at us. "Mistress Calder, and this will be young Tomas." He crouched to the boy with the bright, careful smile they teach them. "Now, Tomas, You're going to walk with me just here at the side behind your father's company all the way to the court. You don't have to do anything. You just walk and you keep your eyes front and it'll all be over before you know it." He straightened, pleased with himself, and ticked something on the board. "Over before you know it," as though the point of the morning were to survive it. Tomas looked up at me. "Where will I be?" he said. "In the line." "Beside the line, love," I said, like the man said. "But where was Papa?" he said. "In it." And the steward smile did the small dishonest thing that smiles do when they have not got an answer, and he said, "Oh, your father marched with his company, of course," and moved on down the row, and I felt my son's hand go very still in mine, the frightened still, and I knew the steward had got it exactly wrong and would never know it. Because Tomas did not want to walk beside the line. Tomas had been told in 4 months of soft, rounded, half-true things that he was near his father this morning, and near to an 8-year-old is not a word that means beside. He wanted to stand where his father had stood. He wanted the place. And there is no place in any protocol on earth for a boy in 2 big boots in the actual line of a marching company. And I knew that, and I had known it walking in. And I had decided I would simply hold his hand and get him to the far end, and let him be disappointed somewhere quiet where I could explain it. I looked up, and the guardsman was looking at my son again. This time it was longer, a full breath. His eyes came down off the horizon and rested on the boy, and something in the set of his jaw changed, not softened exactly. Set harder. The way a man's face sets when he has decided something he has not been given permission to decide. Then his eyes went back to the wall, and his face was a wall again, and I told myself I had imagined it. The bells began, far off and slow, the way they ring them for the remembrance, 1 stroke, then a long wait, then another, so that the whole city counts its dead one at a time. Down the arch a marshal lifted a white-gloved hand. "They're forming," the steward murmured. "Mistress, if you'll bring Tomas to me." I bent to take my son's hand, and found it had already slipped out of mine. He had taken 1 step toward the line, toward the place where the men in dark tunics were assembling, drawn by something I could not see. And the guardsman at the mouth of the arch moved his rifle 1 inch, the smallest sound of leather and steel in all that silence. And I understood that the morning I had braced for was not going to be the morning I got. The marshal's gloved hand came down, and the line began to form. And I have to tell you what a thing like that looks like from 3 feet away, because I had only ever seen it from a curb with 100 other people, where it is a river of black and gold, and the men in it are not men. Up close they are men. They are men whose collars chafe, whose breath shows in the cold, whose eyes flick once toward the marshal and then lock forward. My husband's company assembled in 2 ranks along the inner wall of the arch, and I watched them dress the line, that small shuffle that pulls 40 men into 1 straight edge, and I understood, standing there, that I had married into something I had spent 6 years failing to take seriously. They were beautiful. I had never let myself think the word about the thing that took him. But they were, in that gray light, in that bell-counted silence, 40 men making themselves into 1 thing, on purpose, for a reason none of them would have been able to say out loud without sounding like a fool. And there was a gap in the line. I saw it before I understood it. 2nd rank, 3rd from the standard, a space where a man should have been, the file closed up around it but not over it, the way you leave a place at a table. The man to either side of the gap had set his alignment to it. They were dressing the line on an empty space. That's where Tomas started and stopped. "Yes," I said, though I did not actually know. I knew the way you know a thing in your spine before your mouth catches up. That was my husband's place. They had left it open. They marched the remembrance with the years fallen still in the line as a gap, so that the company is never short a man even when it is. No one had told me. It was not in any of the rounded, softened things they had said to me. It was the one true thing in the whole morning, and they had let me walk up on it cold. I put my hand on my son's shoulder to steady myself as much as him, and I felt him go rigid under it, staring at the gap. And I knew, the way you know your own child, exactly what was forming behind that still, frightened face. "Tomas," I said low, "no. I want to stand there. You can't love, it's not. It's Papa's." "I know it is." My voice did something I had promised myself it would not do that morning. "I know it is, and that's exactly why you can't. You'd be in the way. I was going to say you'd spoil it. And I am ashamed of that even now, because what I meant was you'd break my heart in front of 40 men, and I cannot afford it. And those are not the same thing, and an 8-year-old can hear the difference." He looked up at me, and his chin was doing the thing his father's chin used to do, the small hard set against a thing too big to argue with, and he said very quietly, "I won't be in the way. I'll stand right. I'll stand right." He had been practicing. Somewhere in the 4 months I had been managing his grief like a household account. My son had been teaching himself to stand the way his father stood, so that if he ever got the chance he would not embarrass the place. The floor went out from under me a little. I have been a steady woman most of my life, and I was not steady then. The steward was at my elbow with his clipboard and his patience. "Mistress, we really must take our position. The procession steps off on the 3rd bell." He reached gently for Tomas's other hand. And the guardsman from the mouth of the arch was suddenly there. I did not see him cross to us. That is the truth, and I will not improve it. One moment he was a fixed point at the inner wall, and the next he was standing over the steward. Not having run, not having hurried, guardsmen do not hurry. Hurrying is for people who have lost control of the situation. But there, full height, the bearskin making him enormous, and the steward froze with his hand half out toward my son. "Corporal," the steward said, "you're out of position." "Yes," the guardsman said. It was the first word I heard him speak, and it was not an apology. He looked down at the steward and then past him at me, and his eyes were a soldier's eyes, gray and level and giving nothing. And then they went down to Tomas, and they gave something after all, just for a moment, before he shut it off. "The boy's father," he said to me, "not a question." "Lieutenant Calder," I said. "Reth Calder he was." I know who he was, quietly, flatly, and something in the way he said it told me he did not mean he had read it off a card. The 3rd bell had not rung. The marshal was looking down the arch toward the disturbance, and a sergeant was starting toward us with the particular walk of a man who intends to make a problem stop happening. The steward had gone the color of paper, and the corporal Linnet turned his back on every one of them, which I would learn later is a thing that simply is not done, and crouched down on one knee on the cold stone in front of my son, so that his eyes were level with the boy's, the great bearskin tipping forward, and said something to him that I could not hear. I saw Tomas's face. I saw the fright go out of it. I saw something come into it that I had not seen since the spring, and I would have given a year of my life to hear what the man said, and I did not hear it, and Tomas has never told me, and I have decided that is right. Some things a man says to a boy are not for the boy's mother. What I heard was the sergeant arrive and stop, and the corporal stand back up to his full height with his hand resting, light, deliberate, on my son's shoulder, claiming him in front of all of them, and say to the sergeant, in a voice pitched for the record, "Sarnt, the lieutenant's boy walks his father's file. 2nd rank, 3rd from the color. I'll dress him." The sergeant's jaw worked. "Corporal Linnet, there is no provision." "Then I'll answer for it," Linnet said. And the 3rd bell rang. You have to understand what that bell meant. It was not a starting gun. It was a wall coming down. From the moment of the 3rd stroke, the procession was a single body in motion, and a single body in motion through the public ground of the Verimund Remembrance is a thing that does not pause, does not double back, does not stop for a grieving woman or a frightened boy or a corporal who has decided to throw his career into a gap in the 2nd rank. Whatever was going to happen, it was going to happen on the move. in front of the standards and the cameras and the silent thousands along the route, and there would be no taking it back. The sergeant looked at the corporal for 1 second more. I have wondered since what passed in it. The sergeant was an older man, gray at the temple under the bearskin, and his eyes went from the corporal's face to my son's boots, the 2 big boots, and to the gap in the second rank, third from the color, and something in his face that had been all regulation went somewhere older than regulation. He had marched these remembrances before. He knew whose gap it was. He must have known. Second rank, third from the color, the sergeant said. Dress him, corporal, and God help you at the inquiry. And he turned and walked back to the head of the line as though nothing had occurred, which is its own kind of mercy, and I did not appreciate it at the time. It happened fast then. Linnet took my son not by the hand but by the shoulder, the way you move a soldier and not a child, and walked him 3 steps to the line and set him in the gap. Second rank, third from the standard. The men to either side did not look down. That is what undid me, if you want to know the moment. Not the kindness, the discipline. The 2 men flanking that gap had been dressing their line on an empty space for a year of remembrances, on the memory of a man. And when a living boy stepped into it, they simply closed their alignment around him, as though he had always been coming, as though they had been holding the place for exactly this. And they fixed their eyes front and gave my son the one thing he had wanted in 4 months, which was to be treated as though he belonged there. Linnet knelt one more time, fast, and squared the boy's shoulders with both gloved hands, and tilted the 2 big chin up a half-inch with 1 knuckle, and said one word I did hear, because he said it loud enough on purpose, for the men. Front. And my son fixed his eyes front. Mistress. The steward had recovered enough to remember his job, and his job now was me. You'll walk the family path here to the side, parallel to the... I'll walk where I can see him, I said, and I must have said it in my husband's voice, because the steward closed his mouth and showed me to a place along the inner rope where I could keep pace with the second rank, 3 feet off the line, close enough to see the back of my son's head and the ridiculous, heartbreaking set of his small shoulders trying so hard to be a wall. The marshal's hand went up, came down. The line stepped off on the left foot, all of it at once, the slow march they keep for the remembrance, and I will tell you that the sound of 40 pairs of boots coming down together on the wet stone went into me like a hand closing around something I had been keeping clenched for 4 months. And in the middle of that sound, off the beat, a half count behind and scrambling to catch it, came the slap of a pair of boots that were too big for the boy wearing them. He could not keep the step. Of course he could not, he was 8. The men's stride was a grown man's slow march stride, designed across centuries to look like grief made into geometry, and my son's legs were not long enough to make the geometry, and for the first 10 yards he was simply a small boy half running in oversized boots to stay in a line of marching men, and I heard a sound from the rope line of public behind me, a soft, awful sound. The sound of 1,000 strangers' hearts going out to a child all at once, and I thought, this was a mistake. This is the thing I was afraid of. He is going to be the boy who could not keep up at his father's remembrance, and that is what they will remember, and I will never forgive that corporal as long as I live. And then the man on my son's right broke the geometry. He did it so smoothly I nearly missed it. The guardsman flanking Tomas, a big fair-haired man whose name I never learned, shortened his stride, not all at once. Over 3 or 4 steps he bled his pace down, a quarter count, a half, until his slow march matched the only stride my son's legs could make, and the man on the boy's left felt it and matched him, and the 2 men behind matched them, and it went down the file like a single breath let out slowly. The whole second rank quietly, deliberately, against every instinct of 40 years of training, slowing itself to the pace of an 8-year-old's legs. They redressed the entire company on a child. I did not understand at first what I was seeing. I thought the procession had simply slowed. Then I saw the first rank check itself to match, and the standard-bearer ease his pace, and the drum at the head pick up the new, slower count without a missed beat, and I understood that the corporal linnet, who had fallen in at the rear of the file when the line stepped off, where I could no longer see him, had not put my son into the line and left him to drown. He had put him into the line, and then the entire line had decided, man by man, without a word passing between them, to carry him. And my son stopped scrambling. I watched it happen between one step and the next. The boots came down on the beat. His small shoulders found the rhythm the men had built for him, and he stopped being a boy chasing a procession and became, terribly, perfectly, a soldier in the second rank, third from the color, eyes front, chin up, walking his father's file at his father's company's pace, because his father's company had slowed the sacred and unalterable march of the Verimund remembrance to the length of his stride, and nobody in all that watching silence said a word to stop them. The bells counted on. We came out from under the lantern arch into the open, into the gray light and the full length of the route, and the silent thousands, and I saw the cameras turn. I had dreaded the cameras. A widow learns to dread them. They are kind to your face and unkind to your privacy, and they had filmed me at the gate ceremony in the spring with my jaw set so hard it ached, and I had hated the picture. Now they turned, all of them, the long lenses and the raised phones along the whole front of the crowd, and they did not turn to me. They turned to the second rank, third from the color, to the small figure in the two big boots keeping perfect time in a company of grown men, and I felt the attention of the entire route swing onto my son like the sun coming out. And here is the thing I had not understood about that morning, and would not understand fully until later, when I saw it the way the city saw it. From the curb, you could not see that the company had slowed for him. You could not see the four-step adjustment, the quarter counts bled off man by man. From the curb it simply looked as though a marching company of the house on the most solemn morning of its year had a boy in the line and was matching its stride to his perfectly as though it had always been his to set. It did not look like an accommodation. It looked like an honor. It looked, to 10,000 people who did not know the story, exactly like what it was, a company carrying one of its own. A woman near me on the family path put her hand over her mouth. An old man at the rope took off his hat, and the silence that the remembrance builds on purpose, the bell-counted, breath-held silence, changed its quality. It got heavier. It got full. I have stood in a lot of silence in my life, and most of it is empty. The silence of a house after the worst phone call, the silence of a bed with one side of it cold. This was the other kind. This was the silence of a great many people deciding at the same moment to feel something together and to be quiet about it out of respect. It pressed on my chest. I kept walking. We were perhaps 400 yards along when the trouble came, the way trouble comes at things like this, wearing a good coat and a lanyard. A man stepped off the official platform to the side of the route and came down toward the line with the brisk, low-shouldered walk of someone who has been sent to fix an irregularity before it becomes a thing. He had the look of protocol about him, not a soldier, an administrator, the kind of man whose whole authority is that he knows the order of events and will not have it disturbed. He fell in beside the line on the far side from me, and I saw him speaking low and fast up toward the head of the company, and I saw the word he was making with his mouth even though I could not hear it. Stop, or close enough, halt the boy, take him out. This is not in the order of events. My stomach dropped. I started forward to do what, I do not know, to put my body between my son and a man with a lanyard, the oldest and most useless instinct there is, and a hand closed on my arm. It was the old sergeant, the gray-templed one who had said God help you at the inquiry. He had dropped back from the head of the line to the family path, to me, and his hand on my arm was not restraining me so much as anchoring me, and he said, without looking at me, his eyes front like all of theirs, "Don't, mistress, watch." So I watched. The administrator reached the head of the company and put his low, fast words on the marshal, and I saw the marshal, the man who controlled the entire procession, whose raised hand the whole morning bent to listen to him with a face like the arch itself. The administrator gestured back down the line at my son. The cameras, I am sure, caught all of it. And the marshal turned his head slowly and looked down the length of his own procession at the boy in the second rank keeping perfect time, and looked back at the administrator and said one thing, one sentence. I could not hear it. The administrator said something more. He had a lanyard and he was not finished. And the marshal lifted his white-gloved hand, the hand the whole morning obeyed, and held it up flat between himself and the administrator, the way you stop traffic, the way you say no further, and held it there until the man with the lanyard stopped talking. Then the marshal faced front again, and resumed the slow march beat with his own boots, and the administrator stood at the side of the route with his coat and his clipboard and his correct knowledge of the order of events, and was left behind by it. The sergeant let go of my arm. "There," he said, very low, and I heard in that one word 40 years of a man who had watched administrators try to halt things that should not be halted and had not, until that morning, ever seen one fail to. "Now keep walking, mistress. Your boy's doing fine." My boy was doing more than fine. My boy had found something out on that route that I had been unable to give him in 4 months of soft, rounded lies, and I could see it in the back of his neck. He had found out that his father's place was real. Not a story I told him, not a folded standard in a drawer. A real place in a real line that real men had kept open for a year and had now, for the length of a morning, let him stand in. And the keeping of it was the proof of the thing I had never been able to make him believe, which was that his father had mattered to someone other than us. That somewhere out past our kitchen and our grief, there were 40 men who had dressed their line on his absence every single remembrance and would go on doing it, and who had looked at his son and shortened their stride. We passed the halfway mark, the bells counted, and up at the head of the line I saw Corporal Linnet for the first time since the arch. He had worked his way forward along the file, quietly, the way they move, until he was marching directly behind my son, one rank back, close enough to catch him if the boots betrayed him, close enough that his eyes never left the back of the boy's head. He had put my son in the gap, and then he had spent the whole procession being the thing standing behind him. I understood, watching him, that he was not going to be at the rear where it was safe. He was going to be exactly where the responsibility was, every step, all the way to the court, so that if there was a price for this, and there would be a price, it would have his name on it and no one else's. I did not know yet why he had done it. I assumed that morning that it was simple decency, that a good man had looked at a grieving boy and bent the rules. It was that. But it was also something I would only learn at the court, at the very end, that turned the whole morning over in my hands and showed me the underside of it, and made me sit down on a cold stone bench and weep in a way I had not let myself weep since the spring. The memorial court came into view at the end of the route, a wide flagged square ringed with the old stone, the standards already set along the far wall, the family seats to one side, and at the center the long, low memorial slab where the company would halt and render its honors, and the years fallen would be named aloud. 900 yards, the sergeant had said. We had nearly walked them. And my son was still in the line. The company marched into the court, and the marshal's voice rang out, the single word that halts a body of men, and 40 pairs of boots came down together one last time and stopped. The silence after it was enormous. Tomas stopped a half-beat late and then corrected himself, brought his 2 big boots together with a small scuff, and stood in the second rank, third from the color, at attention, eyes front, a boy doing a man's stillness, and I had to look at the stone under my feet for a moment because I could not look at the back of his neck any longer. They guided the families to the side. I would not go far. I stood at the edge of the seating where I could still see him, and the sergeant, who had not left me, stood at my shoulder, and the ceremony began. I cannot tell you everything they did. I was not watching the ceremony. I was watching my son hold his stillness through the lowering of the standards, through the long single note that a horn plays at the Verimund remembrance, the note that goes up into the gray and does not come back down, the note that takes the top of your composure clean off. I watched his small shoulders not move. I do not know where he learned it. From a father he had 4 months ago. From a corporal that morning. From the men on either side of him who had carried him 900 yards and were now, having carried him, leaving him to stand on his own, because that is the last gift you give a soldier, to let him stand on his own. Then the naming began. A voice read the names of the years fallen, one at a time, slow, with a space after each one for the bell. And I knew his name was coming, and I braced for it the way I had braced for the whole morning, with both hands closed. And when the voice said, "Lieutenant Reth Calder," into that enormous silence, my son, who had held perfectly still through all of it, did the only thing he did wrong all morning. He turned his head, just slightly, toward the gap on his right, the gap that was his now, that had been his father's, as though to see whether the name had brought the man, as though he had not entirely given up the hope, 8 years old, that his father might be standing in the line beside him after all. And the guardsman on his right, the big fair-haired man who had shortened his stride first, without breaking his own attention, without moving anything but one gloved hand, reached down and laid that hand flat on my son's shoulder. Not to correct him, to answer him, to say, with a touch instead of a word, in front of the standards and the city and the watching dead, "He isn't here, son, but we are, and we have you, and you may turn your head if you need to, because today the line will bend for you." My son faced front again. The hand stayed. I do not remember crying. The sergeant told me afterward that I did. I remember the horn and the names and the hand on the small shoulder, and then it was over, and the company was marching off the court to the slow drum, and a steward was bringing my son back to me across the flags, his 2 big boots scuffing, his face doing something between a soldier's stillness and an 8-year-old's complete collapse, and he reached me and put his arms around my waist and held on, and neither of us said anything, because there was nothing yet that would fit in words. It was Corporal Linnet who gave me the rest of it. He came to us after, when the court had mostly emptied, when the standards had been carried off and the families were drifting toward the gate, and the administrator with the lanyard was somewhere writing his report. Linnet had taken off the bearskin and carried it in the crook of his arm, and without it he was an ordinary-sized man, younger than I had thought, with a soldier's plain, tired face. He stopped a respectful distance off and waited to be acknowledged, the way they do. "Corporal," I said, "I don't know how to." "You don't need to, mistress." He looked down at Tomas, who had come out from behind me to stand very straight in front of the man who had put him in the line. "You held your file, lieutenant's boy. You held it the whole way. Not a man could have asked better." Tomas could not speak. He nodded, the small hard nod, his father's nod. And then Linnet looked at me and decided something, the way he had decided at the arch, and he said, "You should know why I did it, so you don't think it was a kindness to a stranger. It wasn't." I waited. "Your husband pulled me out of a bad place once," he said, simply, flatly, the way the truest men say the largest things. "Years ago, before either of us was anything. I'd not have been standing at that arch this morning if Reth Calder hadn't done a thing for me that he had no orders to do and never once mentioned again. He kept a place for me when there was no provision for keeping it." He glanced at the gap, far across the empty court where the company had marched away and left the standards. "So when I saw his boy this morning looking for the place, I knew what to do. I learned it from his father. You keep the place. Whatever it costs you, you keep the place." I understood then the whole shape of the morning. It was not a good man bending a rule for a grieving child. It was a debt being paid in the only currency that mattered, in front of the only witnesses who counted. A man returning to a soldier's son the exact gift the soldier had once given him, when there was no provision for it and no order to do it and a price to be paid at an inquiry. Reth had kept a place for Linnet. Linnet kept the place for Reth's boy. The line had bent twice across the years, both times for the same reason and both times by a man's free choice and not by any rule, and that, I finally saw, is what the whole gleaming machine of the remembrance is actually for. Not the geometry. The geometry is only how they say it. What they mean is, we keep the place. There was an inquiry. Linnet had told me there would be, and there was. I went to it, and the sergeant went, and the marshal, to my lasting astonishment, went, and stood up in front of the board and said that on the morning in question, the conduct of the company had been, in his judgment, the truest honor he had rendered in 30 years of service, and that if there was no provision for it, then the want of provision was the fault and not the corporal. They did not break Corporal Linnet. They entered a notation, which I am told is the Army's way of frowning at a thing while quietly deciding to keep it. The following autumn, on the first still morning after the gales, the house of Verimund held its remembrance, and my son was invited to walk it. He is invited every year now. They have made it the smallest of customs, that the children of the previous years fallen may, if they wish, walk a few steps of their father's file before the families take their seats, with a guardsman at their shoulder to set the pace. Tomas walked it again that second year, and the third, and he is too old now to walk it as a boy and walks it instead at the rope with the rest of us, a young man with a straight back and a habit of going very still, and every year when the names are read he turns his head, just slightly, toward the gap on the right. I asked him once what Corporal Linnet had said to him that first morning, kneeling on the cold stone of the arch. He was grown by then. He thought about it for a long time, the way his father used to, deciding whether a thing was his to give away. He said Papa was a good soldier, Tomas said at last, and that good soldiers don't lose their place in the line, they just hand it to somebody, and that today the somebody was me. He keeps the boots, the two big boots, they fit him now. He does not wear them. He keeps them by the door the way you keep a place at a table for a man who is not coming back but is not for one still morning a year entirely gone because 40 men in dark tunics decided, against every rule they were sworn to, that he would not be. That is the whole of it. That is what I came to tell you. They keep the place. Whatever it costs them, they keep the place.